Welcome to Vanity Fair, a fictional place where vain and pretentious English social climbers symbolically gathered in the early 1800s. In this session of IntelliQuest's The World's 100 Greatest Books, we'll look at this place in the book named Vanity Fair. This satirical novel, written by William Makepeace Thackeray, was intended for publication as a serial in magazines. It was written, so to speak, by the seat of the author's pants, as the author improvised his way through each installment. Also, the author was paid by the amount of work accomplished, so he made the book lucrative and lengthy. Thackeray improvised as he wrote this book, which was published over a one-year period. The book had 3 titles. The first title, when it appeared as a magazine article, was Pen and Pencil Sketches of English Society. Then it was called A Novel Without a Hero, when it was first published as a book. This subtitle still appears in some editions under the book's final title, Vanity Fair. Thackeray, in the manner used by many authors in the late 1800s, often addressed his readers in the book, calling them "dear reader," or inferring a shared knowledge between author and reader by using the pronoun we throughout the book. For example, he might make an aside during a passage and say about a character, "As we already know, this person is very angry with Lord such-and-such." Thackeray tells us his character's thoughts and feelings in very obvious ways, saying, for instance, that someone covets a booth in Vanity Fair, meaning that a particular character seeks a place in British society. The book Vanity Fair is a long and humorous look at British foibles and manners. It's filled with characters and plot twists, which you would expect from a book that was originally intended as a monthly serial that would leave the reader hungry for more. At the end of every installment, there's a cliffhanger to make the reader want to buy the next issue of the magazine and find out what happened. This book's greatest enjoyment comes from reading Thackeray's sly comments about the story and his characters. He's never at a loss for a witty or revealing remark about the superficial fabric of society or someone's transparent motives. The book is filled with his ideas and theories, which often take the form of very quotable and amusing phrases. For example, regarding money, Thackeray tells the reader in an aside, "What a charming reconciler and peacemaker money is." Thackeray also uses his characters' names as satire. There's a surgeon named Lance, a hanging judge named Sir Coffin, and an affectionate noblewoman called Madame de Saint-Amour. Our heroine's last name is Sharp, because she certainly is, and her social climbing family is named the Crawleys, as in crawling up the social ladder. This is a common use of satire, especially in the last century. In this session, we'll give you a few more examples of the author's wit. But before we review the story of Vanity Fair, let's look at William Makepeace Thackeray and the times that produced this book. Thackeray was born in Calcutta, India, in 1811. He and his family were British subjects who lived in India due to his father's government service. Thackeray's father died when he was 5, and his stepfather was a British officer. While returning home to England from India, Thackeray, a small child at the time, saw Napoleon on the island of Napoleon's exile, St. Helena. This event was obviously quite important to him because Napoleon's military aggression in Europe and the notorious Battle of Waterloo are major dramatic events in the book Vanity Fair. After his return to England, Thackeray's higher education included a few years at Cambridge, where he contributed to a newspaper. But Thackeray was as interested in illustration as he was in literature, and after coming into a modest inheritance, he went to Paris to study art. Unfortunately, Thackeray's poor investments and gambling caused him to lose his inheritance, and he had to cease his formal studies. Thackeray went to work, and luckily was a natural journalist. His talents and ability to produce lots of work quickly made him a popular author for the insatiable British magazine consumers of the mid-1800s. With his career underway, Thackeray married a charming Irish girl who became the model for the character of Amelia in Vanity Fair. They had 3 daughters, but one died in infancy. Thackeray's wife had a mental breakdown after she gave birth to the last of her daughters, and left Thackeray's home to be cared for elsewhere. His daughters were raised by his mother-in-law in Paris, so we can see that his personal life lacked a happy family core. He never remarried. Thackeray was 37 when he completed Vanity Fair. By that time, he was well known for his regular contributions to the famous British magazine Punch, as well as for his earlier book, The Memoirs of Barry Lyndon. This book was made into a movie in the early 1970s, starring Ryan O'Neal. Then he started the magazine articles that became Vanity Fair. Some critics think that Vanity Fair grew into a novel almost by accident, as a result of successive magazine articles. But the book's overall theme and cohesiveness make that seem unlikely. Certainly there is rich improvisation in the book, and there are some discrepancies that show it was written at different times. But overall, Vanity Fair has a dramatic thrust and meaning that one finds in any well-thought-out book. Vanity Fair is more than a social commentary. Thackeray also tried to make sure that it was accurate historically, which is another interesting facet of the book. His personal interest in European history in the early 1800s led him to include that as the backdrop to his novel. His research and writing of the book kept him very busy during 1846. After its publication, Thackeray continued to be successful in the writing trade, although he also made an unsuccessful attempt to run for Parliament in 1857. Considering Thackeray's many social criticisms in Vanity Fair, it's logical that he would want to work in the government and present his many ideas in a forum for change. He also seemed desirous of the kind of worldly success that he satirizes in Vanity Fair. But he never achieved political success and remained a writer until his death. Shortly after he failed to win a seat in Parliament, he wrote another of his famous books, The Virginians. Although Thackeray became a magazine editor in 1859, he resigned the position after a few years because he found it difficult to reject writers' contributions. Thackeray had a full life that was marked by tragedy and reversals of fortune. He didn't seem to be bitter, although his work is filled with satire. He died on Christmas Eve in 1863. Now let's look a little more closely at the book Vanity Fair, before we tell you its plot. Vanity Fair, despite its obvious social commentary, is also an historical novel. The long book is a telling chronicle of Victorian manners and events. Since it wasn't written at one sitting, there are some discrepancies in the characters and their actions. For example, names of minor characters change on occasion from one chapter to the next. Or characters thought dead will make a sudden appearance in the book, after their demise. And of course there is the cliffhanger aspect at the end of the installments, which makes it hard to seamlessly synopsize the book. Vanity Fair has many mini-climaxes and an abundance of characters. This synopsis carries only a flavor of the actual book. During the year that Thackeray was still writing the book, and as installments of it were available to the public, who followed it as closely as we would a primetime TV soap opera, he was besieged by fans who had ideas about how the book should turn out. This is similar to writers of famous TV shows who get suggestions about what their fictional heroes should do. Here's an anecdote that describes one of these instances, told by a former schoolmate of Thackeray's. At this time, Vanity Fair was coming out in monthly parts in its well-known yellow paper covers. Thackeray used to talk about it and what he should do with the persons. A woman one day said, "Oh, Mr. Thackeray, you must let Dobbin marry Amelia." "Well," Thackeray replied, "he shall, and when he has got her, he will not find her worth having." To read Vanity Fair is to read a novel that makes fun of a novel, you might say. Thackeray's story and characters are sometimes broadly comic representations of British society stereotypes. While there are some universal themes in the book, those universal themes are the ones that we generally read in satire, most especially not to take our ideas so seriously. Although technically Thackeray could be called a Victorian novelist, as he wrote in the Victorian era, an era marked by Queen Victoria's prim and proper rule of England, in this book he seems to poke fun at Victorian novelists. Everything is very delicately phrased. For example, it's never clear if some of the supposed lovers consummate their love sexually. Such things simply were not said in Victorian England, no matter how important they were to understanding the plot. The plot of Vanity Fair, briefly, is the story of the young, determined Becky Sharp, who comes into the book with nothing but her ambition and social skills. She's ruthless, usually, and always the center of attention. She gets her own booth in Vanity Fair, as do many of the other characters in the book. The story is sometimes melodramatic, in keeping with Victorian literary tastes, so Vanity Fair is not always humorous, as our satires today usually are. And while Vanity Fair does poke fun at many social conventions, the book retains some idealism, especially when the author states some of his cherished beliefs about love, family, or nation. One thing that's a constant stylistic technique throughout the book is Thackeray's narrative voice. We are always aware that he's speaking, and we hear this book through his tone of voice. Oddly enough, just as we ourselves change our opinions from time to time, the reader of Vanity Fair will hear its author take a different tack in different sections of the book. That's a little unusual for a book, but once again probably represents the way it was written in sections. On occasion, perhaps rushing to meet a deadline, all pretense at consistent style and satire disappears, as Thackeray writes something bizarre or silly. You get the definite impression that some sentences are strictly filler. For example, here's a statement with an eerie comic twist, as well as a preachy quality. Picture to yourself, O fair reader, a worldly, selfish, graceless, thankless, religionless old woman, writhing in pain and fear, and without her wig. Picture her to yourself, and ere you be old, learn to love and pray. This attempt at humor, picturing the woman without a wig, is a little tasteless, but most remarkable here is the preachy quality of telling the reader to learn to love and pray. This is the kind of remark that Thackeray sometimes satirizes and sometimes says in a serious tone. But a sentimental style of writing was characteristic of the Victorian age. Also, such lapses are infrequent, and the book has many memorable lines and thoughts. Of course, not all critics felt this way. The book has been called a complete accident, the result of stringing together a succession of magazine pieces. One amusing critic noted that Thackeray's major literary achievement with Vanity Fair was that, to quote, "time has been killed." But this book is a landmark entertainment, even today, and should be judged as such. It's not the tremendous literary achievement of some of Thackeray's peers, but it does give us an ironic look at a fascinating time in history. The action of Vanity Fair takes place between 1813 and 1830. The main characters in the book are Rebecca, Becky Sharp, the ambitious and unstoppable young heroine; Amelia Sedley, a sweet young woman who helps Becky but is her complete opposite; George Osborne, Amelia's fiancé and the love of her life; William Dobbin, a fine fellow but not a social climber. Vanity Fair opens as Amelia Sedley and Becky Sharp prepare to leave their finishing school. Becky Sharp, the product of a very unconventional, artistic, and poverty-stricken childhood, has made an enemy of the headmistress. Becky, as a very capable assessor of situations, knows that the headmistress is upset with her. Becky says, "Get me a job. We hate each other, and I am ready to go." Becky is 19 years old and an attractive young woman. The headmistress gets Becky a job with a skinflint nobleman, Sir Pitt Crawley. Becky leaves school with her friend Amelia, who is as timid as a fawn. They go to Amelia's home for a holiday. Becky tries to avoid continuing on to her job at the Crawleys by chasing after Amelia's brother, Joseph. Joseph is fat and shy. Thackeray writes, "Joseph Sedley contented himself with a bottle of claret, besides his Madeira at dinner, and he managed a couple of plates full of strawberries and cream, and 24 little cakes that were lying neglected on a plate near him." Amelia's father, Mr. Sedley, sees through Becky, but figures that Becky is better for his son Joseph than if Joseph were to marry a native of India. Joseph's been offered a job in India, so this is the old man's concern, and an obvious remark on who fits where on the social scale. Becky's no bargain, in his view, but at least he doesn't find her as objectionable as he finds an Indian. While staying with her friend Amelia, Becky meets Amelia's family, the Sedleys, and the Sedleys' old friends, the Osbornes. Both are wealthy and socially well-connected families. A marriage is hoped for between Amelia Sedley and George Osborne. George is a young officer, and Amelia is in love with him, although George seems mostly in love with himself. George's best friend is Captain William Dobbin, a young man without pretense or elevated social background like the Osbornes and Sedleys. Dobbin is the clear-thinking hero in this socially muddied satire, and he often comes to the rescue of his so-called betters. Dobbin falls in love at first sight with Amelia, but so respects her love for George that he does everything in his power to help her gain him. When Becky first arrives at the Sedleys, it looks as if she'll persuade Joseph to propose to her and get a wealthy husband, and not have to go to work. But the night that she expects his proposal, Joseph gets drunk, makes a fool of himself, and is taken home by the dependable Dobbin. Becky hasn't made many friends at the Sedleys during her stay because her motives are so obvious and self-centered. In fact, no one in Amelia's household likes Becky except Amelia. Becky leaves to take her job at the Crawleys' mansion. Becky hates her new employer at first sight. She thinks of Sir Pitt Crawley as an old, short, and very dirty man, although she's very desirous of the old man's considerable fortune and title. Sir Pitt has a second wife, Lady Crawley, who came from the lower merchant classes. Because of this, Sir Pitt's family and friends feel justified in snubbing the pleasant young woman. Sir Pitt is a drunk and a wife-beater, but Becky knows that he holds the power in this household, and she makes herself indispensable to him, proofreading his letters and learning how to run his estate. But Becky very wisely makes herself friendly to everyone in the household, even the help, determined to have nothing but friends in this new and rich environment. Sir Pitt has two sons, Pitt and Rawdon. Pitt is a religious hypocrite, and he hates his brother Rawdon, who is a gambling officer and dandy. Rawdon, however, is the favorite of Sir Pitt's sister, Miss Matilda. Miss Matilda is extremely wealthy and sought after by her relations, because, as Thackeray writes, she had a balance at her banker's which would have made her beloved anywhere. When Miss Matilda comes to visit Sir Pitt's estate, Becky so charms Miss Matilda that the old lady invites her to come and stay in London. Once in London, Miss Matilda shows her trust in Rebecca by gossiping with her and telling her everything about the social scene. Miss Matilda showed her friendship, Thackeray writes, by abusing all her intimate acquaintances to her new confidant, than which there can't be a more touching proof of regard. Soon after Rebecca moves to London with Miss Matilda, Sir Pitt's long-suffering second wife dies. Before she's even buried, Sir Pitt is knocking at Miss Matilda's door and asking for Becky's hand. Here is old Sir Pitt's romantic proposal to Becky. "I'm an old man, but a good 'un. I'm good for 20 years. Spend what you like, and have it all your own way." At this, the old man goes to his knees and gives Becky an unmistakable leer. Becky weepingly refuses him, explaining she is already married. Rebecca is sincerely upset because she's miscalculated. She hadn't imagined such a fortune would be available to her, and has married Sir Pitt's son Rawdon in secret. The two leave Miss Matilda's, and Miss Matilda is hysterical and furious at the elopement and at losing her companion, Becky. She gives Rawdon £200 and cuts him out of her will. Meanwhile, Amelia Sedley's family has suffered financial setbacks due to Napoleon's military actions in Europe. Her father is no longer a financial success, so now George Osborne's father doesn't want George to marry Amelia. Mr. Osborne wants George to marry a millionairess, but the heroic William Dobbin intervenes. He reminds George how Amelia loves him, and how George had promised his love to her. They marry, but Mr. Osborne disowns George. George and Amelia go to a seaside town for their honeymoon, and run into another pair of newlyweds, Rawdon and Becky. Amelia can tell that George finds Becky attractive, and Becky does not discourage George's attention. In fact, everyone thinks Becky is more charming than Amelia, except for that keen student of human nature, William Dobbin. Becky is a little afraid of Dobbin, but she is also very busy plotting how she can reinstate herself with the Crawley family and its various fortunes. As Napoleon's army prepares for battle on the European continent, the English army goes to Belgium. The officers' wives, which include Becky and Amelia, continue an active social life similar to the one they had in England. George does very well here with his charm and social connections. Amelia seems too simple a person for George's sophisticated appearance. Becky also shines in military society and even makes friends with generals. Becky takes to mocking Amelia behind her back, and George doesn't stop her. One night, at an important ball, Amelia simply doesn't cut the same figure as the dazzling Becky Sharp. George leaves Amelia's side to mingle with the other social climbers, especially Becky. At one point, Becky leaves a bouquet of flowers and her shawl by Amelia as she dances with Amelia's husband, George. George has left a love note for Becky in her bouquet that Becky finds later. Amelia asks William Dobbin to take her home because she's miserable. Later that night, William Dobbin goes in search of George because in 3 hours the army is to march against Napoleon. George is at a gambling table when Dobbin finds him. As George rushes home, knowing that he faces a battle and possible death the next day, he has a change of heart. Thackeray writes, "Oh, how George wishes that night's work undone, and that with a clear conscience he might say farewell to the tender and guileless being by whose love he has set such little store." George especially regrets that he may never know the unborn child that Amelia is carrying. When Rawdon and Becky part before the battle, Rawdon is much more upset than she is at the thought of their separation, for Thackeray writes, "Becky had known how to divert him, and he had found her society 1,000 times more pleasant than any place or company." But Becky is thinking less of Rawdon than of her options should he not return from Waterloo. The men go to battle, leaving the plump and conceited Joseph Sedley, Amelia's brother, to care for the women. But the sound of guns and battle is unnerving to those left behind. Upon hearing that the English are defeated, Joseph wants desperately to leave. Rebecca sells him her horses at a wildly inflated price, and Joseph flees. The Battle of Waterloo rages nearby for 3 days. George dies on the battlefield. William Dobbin arranges for Amelia to return home, but he arranges it so that Amelia thinks that George left her and her baby boy, named Georgie, an income. After providing for Amelia, Dobbin leaves to join an army regiment in India, which at that time was ruled by England. Becky and Rawdon later moved to Paris, where they live comfortably for a time on the money Becky got from Joseph when she sold him the horses so that he could escape Waterloo. Rawdon is proud of Becky's ability to handle money and believes in her as much as the French soldiers believed in Napoleon, as Thackeray put it. Rawdon and Becky travel in high social circles, and news of them gets back to Miss Matilda, Rawdon's rich aunt. Miss Matilda thinks that Rebecca is using Miss Matilda's name to get into French society, and in anger decides to leave her fortune to Rawdon's brother, Pitt Crawley. Rawdon's income soon becomes whatever he can earn by gambling. This supports Rawdon and Becky when they return with their son to an elegant home in London. They leave many unpaid bills in France, and later leave many bills in London when they return to France. When Rawdon's brother Pitt inherits Aunt Matilda's money, Becky tries to get Pitt's wife, Lady Jane, to introduce her to London society. Lady Jane has a genuine kind feeling towards Becky, and at one point takes Becky into her arms. Thackeray tells us how this hug affected Becky. The embrace somehow brought tears into the eyes of the little adventuress, which ornaments, as we know, Becky wore very seldom. But Becky seems to actually like Lady Jane, in contrast to Becky's indifference to her own son. Becky has not time for the little boy and hires a maid to take care of little Rawdon. But she's aware that she should have more maternal feelings, and whenever Becky wants to make a show of caring for her son, she pulls out a shirt that she's sewing for him. Rawdon outgrows the shirt well before Becky finishes it. One Sunday morning, on a walk, little Rawdon runs into little Georgie Osborne, who is out with his grandfather, Amelia's father, Mr. Sedley. This reconnects the Sedley, the Osborne, and the Crawley families. Amelia Sedley is told that William Dobbin loves another, and William Dobbin's sister writes Dobbin in India that Amelia may marry the local minister. Dobbin leaves India for England immediately, still in love with Amelia. Meanwhile, the elder Mr. Osborne persuades Amelia to give him her son, little Georgie. Amelia has given all her money to her destitute parents, the Sedleys, and has no choice but to give Georgie to old Mr. Osborne. Meanwhile, Becky is doing well in her social climb. Her sister-in-law, Lady Jane Crawley, helps Becky up the ladder, although Lady Jane thinks that Becky is overly friendly with her husband, the newly titled Sir Pitt. Becky's dislike of her son also contributes to Lady Jane's growing distrust. But Becky keeps making friends and connections, especially with a certain Lord Steen, who makes it possible for Becky to be presented at the royal court. This is the crowning achievement of every British social climber. Becky's husband Rawdon cannot understand where she got the beautiful jewels that she wears for her presentation at court. Becky says that she rented the jewels, but they were really a gift from Sir Pitt and Lord Stein. Becky has also been borrowing money from Lord Stein, who forces Becky on her social betters in a slightly sadistic way. Stein himself says that his wife is as gay as Lady Macbeth, and he finds Becky amusing. In high society, there, as elsewhere, the men find her charming, and the women like her not at all. Although Lord Stein eventually sees through Becky's tricks for getting money, he finds her ambitious charade interesting. Even the newspapers detail Becky's social successes. Lord Stein gives a dinner in her honor, at which Becky sings religious songs for his nostalgic and grateful wife. Becky is a social triumph, but her husband feels further and further apart from her. After Becky's triumphant party, Rawdon is walking home when he's arrested for a debt. After a night in jail, he writes a note to Becky asking her to bring money at once. She sends him a note saying that no one can give her the money for another day. Rawdon turns to his sister-in-law, Lady Jane, who has him immediately released from prison. Rawdon quickly walks home, and upon entering the front door, hears Becky's Lord Stein shouting bravo to Becky, who is singing for the gentleman. Becky's wearing the jewels she told Rawdon were rented, and Rawdon realizes that these jewels were a gift from this Lord Stein, whom he has found alone with his wife. He angrily throws the jewels at Lord Stein, leaving a permanent scar in Stein's forehead. Becky gets down on her knees and says she's innocent, and begs Stein to tell her husband that. Stein assumes that this is a trap by the two of them to blackmail him. Lord Stein angrily says he gave Becky thousands of pounds that her husband spent. Rawdon, insulted by this, chokes the lord. At this moment, Rebecca admires her husband. The embarrassed lord leaves, and Rawdon goes through Becky's possessions. He finds a hoard of money, and challenges Lord Stein to a duel, as the money indicates Becky's lack of honor in her relationship with the lord. According to Victorian social conventions in these classes, a husband was supposed to challenge anyone who compromised his wife's honor to a duel. Remember, however, Becky's relationship with Stein is never fully explained, because that would be too indelicate for a Victorian-age novel. Becky's servants, fearing they will never see another paycheck, steal her jewels. Rawdon goes to his brother Pitt and tells him everything that happened. He says he may be killed in a duel with Lord Stein and wants to make sure that his son, little Rawdon, will be provided for. Later, Rawdon's brother Pitt receives another visitor, Becky, who begs Pitt to help her reconcile with Rawdon. Becky is kissing Pitt's hand when Pitt's wife, Lady Jane, comes in and angrily tells Pitt he can choose between them. She leaves the room, and Pitt says he'll try to help the couple get back together. Becky tells Pitt that she encouraged Lord Stein only for Rawdon's sake, as Lord Stein is about to offer Rawdon an important career appointment. Becky also says that she had to manage their money because Rawdon did so poorly in that area. Becky never loses her ability to think on her feet and reconstruct events to her own advantage. Rawdon is having breakfast at a club when he finds himself being congratulated. Lord Stein has offered him a governorship of an island, no doubt to prevent the duel and to get Rawdon out of his life. Rawdon accepts, glad to make Lord Stein literally pay for his indiscretion. Rawdon leaves England, and little Rawdon is cared for by Pitt and Lady Jane. Rawdon also sends a regular sum of money to Becky and dies some years later of a fever contracted in the tropical area that he was sent to govern. Because little Rawdon is in the care of Pitt and Lady Jane, little Rawdon is destined to be, at some future point, the next Lord Crawley. Back in Amelia's life, Amelia spends her time caring for her poverty-stricken parents, while her son is still with Amelia's father-in-law, old Mr. Osborne. Dobbin slowly makes his way back to England and becomes very ill en route. Also on Dobbin's ship is the plump Joseph Sedley, Amelia's brother. Joseph assures Dobbin that Amelia is not betrothed, which is why Dobbin undertook this journey. Now Dobbin's spirits and health are restored to learn that the woman he loves is not promised to another. Upon their arrival in England, Dobbin goes to Amelia's home, and when she sees him, she runs into his arms. Amelia tells him all about her son, and Dobbin says that Joseph has a particular interest in seeing the boy. Joseph became quite wealthy during his travels, and joins his family after a few days of shopping, eating, and drinking. Joseph buys a new home for the family, and all seems well. But when Dobbin tells Amelia that he loves her, Amelia makes it clear that her great love was for her dead husband, George. Amelia's father soon dies, and old Mr. Osborne, who still has her son Georgie, says ironically, "Old Sedley was a better man than I was 20 years ago. A better man, I should say, by 10,000 pounds. He means that his old friend was only better than he is when his old friend was worth more money. Now that he's returned, and despite his relative lack of social breeding, Dobbin's reputation as an honest and noble man is getting around, even to old Mr. Osborne. Old Osborne dies before he has a chance to be reconciled with his daughter-in-law, Amelia. He does, however, leave half of his property to his grandson, Georgie, with Dobbin as executor. Now many people want to be friendly to Amelia, because she's wealthy again, but Amelia is not impressed. Amelia and Georgie, with Amelia's brother Joseph and Dobbin as companions, travel to Europe. Amelia pursues her love of music and is very happy. She also warms to Dobbin and sees that he's a true gentleman, even though he is not as high-born as many of the people she grew up around. Thackeray gives Dobbin these attributes. Beauty of art or nature made him thankful as well as happy, and the pleasure in listening to fine music, as in looking at the stars in the sky or at a beautiful landscape, was a benefit for which he might thank heaven as sincerely as for any other worldly blessing. Here we get insight into Dobbin, but we also hear Thackeray tell us what's of real importance in the world. The happy group is in Germany, pursuing music and attending parties, when Becky re-enters their lives. She sees Amelia's brother Joseph at a festival and asks him to visit her. Since Rawdon left Becky, she's wandered throughout Europe, staying one step ahead of her creditors. Her son, Little Rawdon, is Sir Pitt's heir to the title Sir Pitt, and Little Rawdon is not in the least interested in his mother's sudden show of concern for him. Becky tried to see Lord Steen in Rome, but was threatened by his servant. Now Becky's in Brussels, and remembering what kind and simple people Dobbin, Amelia, and Joseph are, she's pursuing them again. Becky tells Joseph that her son was taken from her, that she has been misjudged, and that Joseph is her true love. Once again, she's taken facts and twisted them to her advantage. When Joseph goes home and tries to convince Dobbin and Amelia of Becky's story, Dobbin won't fall for it. He doesn't trust Becky, and he says that Amelia was jealous of her dead husband's attentions to Becky. Dobbin's statement infuriates Amelia, who spitefully invites Becky to join them, overriding Dobbin's protests. Dobbin leaves, stating that Amelia is not worthy of his love. He rejoins the army. Becky moves in and takes command of Joseph's house. She brings with her some shady friends who try to take advantage of Amelia. Amelia sees that Dobbin was right and writes to him asking him to return. Even Becky wants to now protect Amelia from these shady friends and tells Amelia to send for Dobbin. Then Amelia repeats her old phrase to Becky that she, Amelia, will only ever love George Osborne. At this, Becky makes a heroic gesture. Becky shows Amelia the note George wrote Becky right before Waterloo, asking Becky to run away with him. Becky hopes that this will convince Amelia to give up George Osborne. Indeed, when Amelia sees it, she feels free to return Dobbin's love. 2 days later, Dobbin returns. He and Amelia quickly make plans to marry. Becky successfully ingratiates herself with Joseph and gets his money. Joseph finds Becky frightening but compelling, and he dies a short while later. The Dobbins have a daughter together, as well as little Georgie. They live happily near the Crawley estate, which Becky's son, young Rawdon, inherited. Now little Rawdon is Sir Pitt. Although they all remain close, they have nothing to do with Becky Sharp. She leads a respectable life, which includes charitable works and regular church-going. Dobbin is very fond of working on his book manuscript, The History of the Punjab, a book about India. Amelia believes that Dobbin is, in fact, more fond of writing that book than of her. But Dobbin has never said a word to Amelia that wasn't kind and gentle, or thought of a want of hers that he didn't try to gratify. Now Thackeray ends his book saying, "Which of us is happy in this world? Which of us has his desire, or having it, is satisfied? Come, children, let us shut up the box and the puppets, for our play is played out." This is the end of our book, and all of the players have won a booth in the Vanity Fair. Some players connived to get their spaces, and some players are indifferent to being a part of the world that Thackeray calls Vanity Fair. Becky, the main character in the book, had the furthest to go, because she started out as an unpopular and lowly governess. Although she didn't retain her highest social gains, her indiscretions with Lord Steen took care of that, she still achieved quite a bit. She has financial independence, and her son is a titled lord, although his only communication with his mother is an allowance he sends her. Amelia and Dobbin find what they've both been searching for, a loving marriage. And the other players, too numerous to mention, played out their roles fully, if not happily. Despite some critics' claims that Vanity Fair is a superficial hodgepodge of a book, in that respect it's not unlike life itself, with its fits and starts and changes in fortune. The players all learned from their play, as Thackeray refers to this novel's setting, and now that we've enjoyed their drama, we can, as he suggests, shut up the box and the puppets, for our play is played out.
This is the end of the session.